I'm very pleased to be there today. I'm Antoine Nordez, and I'm in charge of the work package 2 with Joseph Rabita, who is there too. And today we are very pleased to welcome Erik Witvrouw on the stage. So Erik is a professor at the University of Ghent in Belgium in the Department of Physical Therapy and Motor Rehabilitation. He has published over 200 publications in leading journals like British Journal of Sports Medicine, American Journal of Sports Medicine. And all these works are very famous in the field of injury prevention and prediction. So I'm very pleased to welcome Erik on the stage. Yeah, I'm very happy to be there today to listen to you.
Merci Antoine. Mon nom est Erik Witvrouw. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en français? Witvrouw, ça veut dire dame blanche. Alors, ici en France, vous pouvez dire Erik dame blanche. Alors, c'est probablement plus facile. But I will give my presentation in English because I prepared this text and so, but you can ask your questions in French if you want. So, we have been listening to all the speakers before me, and we understand now that injuries are, or the mechanism of injuries is very complex, and we should approach it holistically. However, I will take one step back and look at the physical parameters which actually identify a hamstring injury. Actually, we have two questions. The first question is, can we identify an athlete? And that is probably the most difficult question, and probably the answer is no. And the second thing is, do we know any risk factors? And from these risk factors, we can start building some programs, programs for research, programs for prevention, etc., etc. So I will, of course, start with the known risk factors from the literature. And when we talk about risk factors, and I'm talking about physical risk factors now, we can identify modifiable risk factors and non-modifiable risk factors. And I will start with probably the most studied risk factor, and that is strength. And since we know that hamstrings mainly work during sprinting in an eccentric way, and we know sprinting is one of the most, or probably the most mechanism of an hamstring injury, I will talk about the eccentric hamstring strength. So how important is it that your athletes are strong enough to prevent an injury or to decrease the amount of injuries? Well, this is based upon a systematic review a year ago. And what you can see here is these are all the studies. Not quite sure you can see anything. Okay, good. You see a little red dot here? Yeah, that's me. Okay, so these are all studies, and if the studies are on the left side of this line, then you have that the injured player is, or the injured players are weaker eccentric hamstring strength. If they are on the right side of this line, you have identified that they are stronger. So as you see, it's not that everybody is laying on the left side of the line or on the right side, it's somewhere in the middle, although you can see, and this is the summary, these rectangles, the gray rectangles are the summary of these studies, and you can see clearly that there's a tendency that these rectangles are on the left side, which means that there is a tendency to say that yes, eccentric strength seems to be important. And yes, if you have a weaker hamstring athlete, he seems to be more important or seems to be predisposed to an injury. But it is only a week. It is not significant, but you see that there is a tendency. And probably this is an important aspect because we have been thinking that eccentric strength is a real important risk factor. Okay. So I want to show you one graph of a study we did, and this is the largest prospective study identifying strength as a risk factor. And this is here what you can see. This is the difference between the hamstring guys, or the ones who had a hamstring. These are the red dots, and the white dots are the ones who did not get injured during the 2-season study. And we also, as you could see, we also identified that strength was a risk factor, although weak. Now, what do we mean with a weak risk factor? Because statistics showed us that, as you could see, that the ones who had an injury had some weaker hamstring strength. So what can we do with that in practice? Well, in an ideal world, it's rather simple, because you have you have a dotted line, and this is a cut-off value. And you can say everybody besides that line, on this side here, they're all injured. And on the other side of the line, all these athletes are not injured. So it's very, very simple. You can say, if your value is above or below this value, if your strength is below this value, you will get injured or you will not get injured. So that's an ideal world. But I just showed you what we have found. Now try please with me, try to identify a cutoff point here. So probably your cutoff point is somewhere here, which is probably true because we have a significant difference. So, but if you put the cutoff line here at this value, you will see these are the injured, in gray these are the injured players, then you will see that all these guys who will be above the cutoff line were injured, but had enough strength of the hamstrings. So it makes no use to strengthen them because they're already strong enough, but still they have an injury. On the other side, when you talk about the non-injured guys, you have a lot of them who are below the line, but are not injured. So this is the concept of what Evert was telling you about the holistic approach. So based on one parameter, I must tell you it is impossible to identify a player at risk. But so we cannot identify a player at risk, but we do know some risk factors, and we can take these into account into a more holistic approach. And this is the way we should go. So we should try, or we should continue to keep or to pay importance to these parameters. Now, since I'm a physiotherapist, I'm also interested in the re-injuries. So I will not talk too much about it, but is strength in rehabilitation a really important issue? I was taught, yes. Well, we have done several studies, and the question is no. It is not that the least strong guys are the ones who get re-injured. I can almost say it's the opposite. So strength is not the issue in returning to sports. It is not the issue in getting re-injured. But of course, strength is very important in performance. So we should have sufficient strength. But it's not that if they have sufficient strength, that they will be returning to their sport in a safe environment or in a safe condition. So that is important. Now, something is probably puzzling you, because as Evert also said, what about the Nordics? What about using the Nordics and preventing or decreasing the amount of injuries? Does it work? Well, as you can see here, all these studies show that yes, indeed. It decreases the amount of injuries. And as you can see the rectangle here, it's completely on the left side of this line, meaning it is statistically significant. So, hallelujah, we can reduce, if we implement the Nordics, we can reduce the hamstring injuries with about 50% chance. So that is really something I don't understand. I'm just telling you that strength is not important in an injury, in a re-injury, but then again, I tell you, if we look at the studies of the Nordics and we increase the strength, we can decrease the amount of injuries. So something is wrong there. So what is really going on here? Well, and it's been discussed here before, but it comes back to this issue. Take a look at this graph. And now, first of all, take a look at these guys, the older guys. Let's say the red line. So the older guys. They have a real high risk of getting injured. But if you increase their strength, because on the x-axis you have the strength, so they have a real high risk for an injury if they have a rather low strength. So it's a combination. Although if you increase their strength by doing Nordics, what will happen? You will significantly decrease their chances of a hamstring injury. So the question is Nordics reducing a risk for a hamstring injury? Yes, it will, significantly in an older population. But what about the younger athletes? Now look at the younger athletes. Even if they have a really low eccentric strength of their hamstrings, the risk of getting injured is relatively low. So you can increase their strength, but it will not help you because their chances to get injured is very low or very, very, very low, which doesn't make any significant difference. So stop strengthening them and use your time more efficient, because strengthening them will not decrease their chances of getting injured. Okay? So it depends on the risk, on the age. So as you all have heard now, an injury is a multifactorial problem, and strength will be influenced by other elements like age, and therefore you should take that into account. So my first take-home message today is eccentric strength is important, but only in athletes at high risk, and that means, for instance, older athletes. Now, my second variable to discuss is fascicle length. You can see here how fascicle length is measured. So it is the length of a fascicle between two aponeuroses, although you must remember that we can never, it's only an estimation of the exact length because our probes are not long enough to measure it, but okay. So this is fascicle length. If we look at the graphs and the importance of fascicle length in hamstring injury risk, you see this graph, and you see it's very, very similar to the older aged graph in strength and chances of a hamstring injury. So you see here, and these the Australians were able to put a cut-off line, and they say if your fascicle length is besides this line, so a shorter fascicle length, you get a high risk to get an injury. And if you have a fascicle length longer here, your chances to get a hamstring injury are decreasing. So yes, fascicle length seems to be very important. However, and this is exactly the same thing as I told you before, we have some contrasting results. And why do we see these contrasting results? Well, it's simple. Look at this. These are the ones I just showed you in the beginning, are the older athletes. But if I add the younger athletes, let's say the youngest athletes, they hardly have any chance for a hamstring injury. And that hamstring injury risk will stay about the same. It doesn't really matter what fascicle length they have. So again, fascicle length might be important, but only in the older athletes. But if it is important in the older athletes, can we change it? Yes, we can. We can change fascicle length by strengthening the hamstrings, especially in an eccentric way, and especially with exercises that produce strength at lower or high lengths. So my second take-home message is actually the same as the first one. The fascicle length is only important in athletes with older age or with a history of a hamstring injury. And we can change fascicle length in these athletes. My third parameter is a synergy between the biceps and the semitendinosus. So I will give you a little explanation on that. So what we did is we put athletes in an MRI machine, then we fatigued them until they couldn't perform anymore eccentrically, and then we put them again in the MRI machine in order to see what muscle of the hamstring group was performing the eccentric muscle activity. And this is what we found. What you see here, and first you have to see, or you have to look at the control group, is you see that the semitendinosus is in most of the players, these were all in elite football players, about 50%, the semitendinosus is responsible for 50% of the hamstring eccentric activity. The biceps is responsible for about 30%, and the semimembranosus for about 20%. Now the question is, what is happening with players who got an injury? That's one study we did. And what is happening with players who will become injured? So we took this measurement before they were injured, so it was a prospective study, and we found the same thing as in the cross-sectional study. And what was the thing we found? We found that the players who got injured or will get injured in the future had a decrease in the semitendinosus, and the amount of decrease was exactly the same as the amount of increase in the biceps. And we believe it is because they have a conjoint tendon. So if the one is decreasing, the one is increasing. And if so it's always the same. Together, they're always responsible for 80% of the eccentric hamstring activity. Now, most of the time that the biceps is injured. So does this mean that we should get our attention to the biceps? No, what we found is, of course the biceps is injured, but the biceps is a victim. The biceps is a victim and increases its activity probably because we see this decrease in semitendinosus. So we should not focus on the biceps only, or in prevention, we should focus on the semitendinosus, because if the semitendinosus stays high, we will have less compensation with the biceps, and we will have less hamstring injuries in the biceps. Because if the biceps is increasing its activity, it's not built for that high activity. It has much more fast-twitch fibers compared to the semitendinosus. So its architectural structure is not good. The question is, can we focus on the biceps and can we focus on the semitendinosus? Yes, we can. It depends on which kind of exercise you are doing. And as you can, as you can see here, when you do hip dominant exercises, you will have a higher activation of the biceps. If you do knee dominant exercises, you will have a higher activation of the semitendinosus. And this might be one of the reasons why a Nordic hamstring really works as a prevention. Not only is it strengthening the hamstrings, but it's selectively strengthening the semitendinosus, which is a good thing because the biceps don't have to compensate. So this is how you should do it. This is semitendinosus, this is biceps, and this is me in my previous years. This is the best exercise for a hamstring activation. So my third take-home message is you should not only pay attention to the biceps, instead you should pay attention to the semitendinosus in your prevention training by doing Nordics, by doing some knee flexion exercises. And in the rehabilitation, you start with the semitendinosus and later on you continue with the biceps. What about running? What about the running biomechanics? We all know that maximal sprinting is the most important mechanism of a hamstring injury. So maximal sprinting, what about the technique of sprinting? Is it important or is it not important? Well, we did a study. It's not such a fancy gym as I've seen in Caroline's presentation. But anyway, so we took some elite football players and we did some 3D biomechanics and EMG mechanics, etc., EMG investigations, and I'll show you in a minute. So we followed them for 1.5 seasons, and we tried to see which of these guys were going to be injured and which of them did not get injuries of the hamstrings. So first of all, we look at the biomechanics of running. And what did we find? Well, we found that the guys who have, let's say, more core stability during running are less frequently injured in hamstring injuries. So we see the guys who did not get injured, they have less anterior pelvic tilt, they have less, as you can see here, thoracic side bending. So yes, core stability during running seems to be an important aspect of hamstring injury. So this is my fourth take-home message. Sprint training, correct technique, is very important in decreasing the amount of hamstring injury. So a correct technique biomechanically seems to be important and should be an important aspect of the training. Next parameter is the posterior chain. We all know the hamstring is not the only muscle in the posterior chain. It is working together with some muscles in the back, and of course with the very strong glute max here. So are hamstrings working together with them, or are hamstrings working in synergy with them? And if it is synergy, maybe something is wrong in that synergy that predisposes certain athletes to hamstring injuries. So what did we do? And these are the guys who are saying this. What did we do? We looked at the onset of muscle activation of the back muscles, the glute max and hamstrings. And we also looked at the amount of muscle activity. That was when all the athletes were uninjured. And then we followed them 1.5 seasons, and we found some were injured, and we compared both groups. And what did we see? We saw that the guys who were not injured had a delay in hamstring activity. In other words, the guys who were injured had a first reaction of the hamstring in decelerating the hip towards flexion. So as you can see here, clearly, you see that these guys are the ones who get injured. So they have a very first reaction time of the hamstrings, and they only have a delayed action of the multifidi of the glute max, meaning that the first deceleration of this movement needs to be performed by the hamstrings. So there will be a lot of force on the hamstrings, and these are the guys who are having a higher risk for a potential hamstring injury later on. Second thing is, what about the amount of muscle activity? Well, the same story actually. You see that the amount of glute max activity in the ones who get injured is significantly lower, and the same with the trunk muscles. So the hamstrings are doing all the work here. This is what I told you. So my next take-home message is, it's not only important to train the hamstrings, but it's also important to train glute max, to train the trunk muscles to get involved during the sprinting activity, not only in the amount of activity, but also in the timing of the activity. They should come first, and the hamstring should come later on. Okay? So you have to waken them up if you see this is not happening. Is running load, the amount of running and sprinting especially, is it important for a hamstring strain injury? Yes, we know from several studies in the literature, and it is as old as we know, that if you increase your load too much in 1 week or in 1 month, then you will be more susceptible for injuries. We know that is very simple. Do we also know it for hamstring? Yes, we do know it. There is a nice study a few years ago where they looked at the association between running exposure and hamstring injuries, and running exposure was as the load, the total amount, as well as the amount of sprints. And yes, they found a clear association between this load and a hamstring injury, but the strongest association was the week before or 14 days before the injury. Now that's great. Now this is something you can use. But I have to tell you, it's a risk factor. Can you identify an athlete? I'm very sorry. And I will show you why you cannot. Look, these are the graphs from that study, and the white dots are the ones who are injured during the study. And as you can see, you cannot, it's not a cluster here, what you expected. It's not a cluster here, or it's not a cluster here. It's all over the place, but significantly more in this area. But it's impossible. Even this guy here is one of the lowest. He has one of the lowest loads of sprinting in the last 2 weeks. And yes, he got injured. So again, we know it's a risk factor, but it's very difficult or not possible to identify a player based on the absolute or relative sprinting load. And this is my sixth take-home message. It is important, but not on an individual basis, or not possible to identify an athlete based on that load. Now, my seventh parameter is the volume of the muscle-tendon junction. Now, we all know that most of the injuries are not happening in the tendon, as you can see here. It will not be a strain in the middle of the muscle here, but it will be a strain between the tendon and the muscle, so in the muscle-tendon junction. So the strain, you strain your muscle at that spot. Why? Because it's the weakest position. It's the weakest link in the chain. So what was our hypothesis? What about the volume of the muscle-tendon junction? So we did a study, and these results are not published yet, but I can give you a preview of it. So we measured here the muscle-tendon junction, and we took it in relative comparison with the strength of the athlete. So you have, for instance, and this was our hypothesis, you have very strong athletes with a small muscle-tendon junction volume. These will probably be the guys who are more fast or more prone to an injury. And this is exactly what we found here. You see the blue ones, this is not a prospective study, but a cross-sectional. So we identified the ones who had a hamstring injury and are playing again without any problems, with the ones who did not have a hamstring injury, again in football players. And we identified that these ones who were injured before had a smaller volume of the muscle-tendon junction. Now the question is it the cause or the consequence of the injury? We don't know, since it was a cross-sectional study. The second question is, can we change this muscle tendon junction volume? I don't know. So these are interesting questions, but I cannot give you an answer. So as a result, I cannot give you a take-home message. But I think it's an important aspect to think about in future research, because if it is the cause of an injury, and if we can change it, maybe we should look or identify or measure it in our athletes and try to change it in these who are at high risk because they have a smaller volume. Okay, this was all about modifiable risk factors. What about non-modifiable risk factors? Now you will say, well, if they're not modifiable, why would you talk about it? Well, we can maybe not modify the factors, but we can take these factors into account when we set up training programs. And the first risk factor or parameter I want to talk about is the muscle typology. We identified a methodology which is a non-invasive measure of identifying muscle typology. Instead of taking muscle biopsies, we don't like to do it in our elite athletes, especially not the elite football players. They will not allow to do it. Anyway, so we have this non-invasive technique, and we measured several Belgian football players, although you will probably laugh a little bit because the Belgian elite football players are not really that elite anymore, okay? But we also took some Premier League football players. Now again, you will laugh because you will say, the English, they can hardly play football. Anyway, this is where we did a study with. We should come back and do it with the French, I guess. So what did we find? And we identified the muscle typology in a slow, intermediate, or a fast guy. And we all know that endurance sports are more slow typologies. Explosive sports are more fast typologies. What about football players? Well, you can see that it's a mix of all these typologies. And this is interesting because now we can identify, is typology important in a hamstring injury? And so what did we find? Well, we found this is the cumulative hazard ratio. So the higher this ratio is, the higher your chances of getting injured. This is a prospective study, as I told you. So if you have a slow typology, this is your hazard ratio of getting injured. If you have an intermediate typology, this is your hazard ratio. And look at this if you have a fast typology. Your chances are really high. And this is one of the most or the highest identified risk factors of all the things I've been talking about. This is a much higher risk factor compared to the eccentric hamstring strength. This is very, very much, or it gives you a high probability. So now you will say, okay, but you cannot change the muscle typology, or you don't want to change it. So what's the use of talking about it? Well, that's true. And we all know, and this is the reason I just show you this, we all know the slow twitch muscle fibers are, let's say, the working guys in a muscle, and the fast twitch guys, these are the sprinting types. And I told you before, the biceps has more fast twitch fibers compared to the working fibers. So that's why the biceps is more, if you let them work more, let them take more of this work, then you will get injury. Now, why talk about muscle typology if you cannot change it? Well, because of this. Because you can change, of course, the recovery period. You can determine when you will have the new training session. And if you have a group of, let's say, football players, all with different muscle typologies, some of the guys, they have recovered completely from the previous training session, and you give them a new training session, which is perfect for them and puts them in a super compensation in the end. But if you have in the same squad a guy with a very fast muscle typology, he will not have recovered during that training period. And if it keeps on going and keeps on going, the muscle will be really fatigued and you will get a higher chance of muscle injuries. So no, you cannot change muscle typology, but you can take muscle typology into account and you can do something like this and then train them when they're recovered, and then you will have less muscle injuries in these guys. So this is my 7th take-home message. Another non-modifiable risk factor is actually age and previous hamstring injury. Age, I talked to you before, previous hamstring injury is the strongest risk factor, and it will, all of the prospective studies will identify having an injury, having a hamstring injury as an important risk factor for a new future hamstring injury. So I can put here a lot of literature, and very importantly, when I talk to you about can we identify players at risk, well, now we can. With a 60–70% prediction accuracy, we can predict an individual player at risk. Meaning, this time, yes, we can use age and previous hamstring injury as a predictor of an individual player. And that is important because you cannot change the player having a previous injury and you cannot change the age. But in that player, you need to implement a prevention program or a program focusing on several aspects I've been talking about it within the modifiable risk factors. In these guys who are young and did not have a previous hamstring injury, you better spend your time doing something else. The last thing I want to talk about is a non-modifiable risk factor is a previous ACL injury. As you know, when doing an operation for an ACL injury, the surgeons in Belgium, at least, I'm not quite sure in France, they take the semitendinosus. Because they tell me that if you take the quadriceps tendon or the patellar tendon, it gives a lot of anterior knee pain, which is true. So that's why they take the hamstring injury, the hamstring graft. Now, hamstring graft, if you take it, what happens with the semitendinosus? So the first time I was confronted as a physio with this operation technique, I asked, I'm not quite sure if you've ever seen an operation taking a hamstring graft. So what they do, they go inside there and they strip the hamstring tendon, the semitendinosus tendon, they take it away. So when I saw this for the first time, I asked the surgeon, what happens with the semitendinosus muscle? And he said, oh, Erik, you don't have to worry. Nature will take care. The hamstring will grow against the rest of the muscles, against the biceps, and it will function normally again. I said, okay, thank you. I was a little bit worried. Well, what do we know today after 10 years of hamstring graft operations? We do know that, and several studies have found out, that we have less cross-sectional area of the semitendinosus. So we have less volume of the semitendinosus. So this probably means we have less hamstring strength because semitendinosus is responsible for 50% of the eccentric hamstring activation. Oh my God, is that a problem? Yes, it might be a problem. And in addition to that, we again investigated these guys with the techniques I showed you before, and we were able to prove exactly the same thing as in the guys who are prone for a hamstring injury or who had a hamstring injury in the past, that ACL patients, all ACL patients, are prone for hamstring injuries because they have a decrease in the activity of the semitendinosus, and they have a compensatory increase in the activity of the biceps. So all ACL patients are potentially at risk for a hamstring injury because surgeons take away the semitendinosus tendon, and that makes them not only prone because they have a lower volume, but also because of the compensation of the biceps. So take care of that. You cannot change that anymore, but a guy who had an ACL operation, he, and where they took the hamstring graft, he is at increased risk. So you should train his semitendinosus in order to do some spring training. So first semitendinosus training, volume increase, trying to get the activity of the semitendinosus back to normal again, and then later on, once he's normalized, you can start with some sprinting in these guys. So do we know everything? Can we prevent hamstring injuries? I think Evert showed us we cannot. We cannot prevent it. We can decrease it. And of course, we have to take everything into account. As Evert told you, very good. It's a very, very complex system. This is about ACL injuries, but we know it's the same about whatever injuries. And Evert told you the holistic approach. Of course, we need a holistic approach. But what I told you is that some physical parameters might decrease the chance of getting a hamstring injury. And you guys, you can do something about it. But you have to take into account it's impossible to identify one specific player unless he has an ACL injury, is an older guy, and had some hamstring injuries in the past. You can predict with maybe 80% for sure, he will have a hamstring injury in the future. So that's the guy you need to focus on. If he's a very young guy, no hamstring injuries, no ACLs, etc., the chances of having a hamstring injury will be neglected. But you can still train on the quality of the sprinting technique, on working mechanism of all the different muscles together, and then I think you are there. So thank you very much and good luck. I guess you need it because the Moroccans, they beat the Belgians, and you know the Belgians, we almost beat the French 4 years ago. You were cheating a little bit, okay, but no, I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very nice talk. I'm very impressed by the ability of your group to do big prospective studies. It's very impressive. And it gives a lot of inputs about injury, so congratulations. Is there questions in the audience? I have plenty of questions, so vas-y.
Thank you very much, Erik. We knew some of the stuff you did and some are new, so thank you for giving this update. Again, I hope that our colleagues, medical doctors, were listening to you, because this link between anatomy and injury risk is something we did not much dig into so far. And you mentioned the muscle tendon junction volume. Did you look at other aspects such as the length of this junction, or maybe, because you didn't mention mechanical properties of the tissues, is this something you are digging into it? And yeah.
Yeah, no. As you know, doing studies, it's always difficult, and you have to take big groups, you have to do prospective work, and then you have to do, in an ideal world, you have to measure 100 parameters, but you cannot put them all together in the statistics because then your power is too low or you are making too much errors. So my short question to your answer is no, we did not. We measured this one risk factor. I think, or I hope, by doing these like 1 or 2 parameter studies, we will have better knowledge or a better insight in, okay, this parameter might be interesting to investigate together with this and this and this and this parameter in a really big prospective study. And that's why I think it's still useful to do studies with only 1 or 2 parameters to identify, is it really important or not? Today, I think measuring strength is probably not that important anymore. So I will not add it to my prospective studies again. But maybe measuring muscle tendon volume might be a new thing, like elastography, and looking at the differences in compliance of this muscle tendon junction.
Is there other questions? Yeah, Charles?
Thank you for your presentation. I will talk about the take-home message you said about eccentric strengthening exercises. You talked about knee flexion and hip extension exercises, but how can we be sure we work on the right muscle while doing these exercises? And what about tibial rotation while performing these specific exercises, like maybe Nordic hamstrings?
It's a good question. Let me tell you one thing first. Whatever activity you are doing, you're always activating both muscle groups. And I didn't even talk about semimembranosus, but it's always the same. So you're always training or strengthening as well the biceps as the semitendinosus, and we cannot see it as different units. Of course, they're one muscle group, so they will be contracted together. However, if you, in a neutral rotation position, if you do more of knee flexion exercise, you will have a little bit, or you will have more attention or more focus on the semitendinosus group, while if you do the hip deceleration exercises, you will affect more the biceps, and probably, and that is important, you will have also more the influence of the posterior chain, the trunk muscles, the glutes, and so not only for strength issues, but also for synergy issues, I think these exercises are very good. I do know that if you rotate your tibia more to the lateral side, you will activate more your biceps compared to internal rotation. So if you want, you can add that also into your exercises.
Is there another question? Or I may ask one, perhaps. Erik, I like your message about be focused on the athletes that needs to be to do exercise for the prevention, but it may also have I would say a bad outcome, because for instance, increasing the fascicle length can be quite long. You can't do that in 2 days. Increasing muscle volume, tendon volume is probably longer. It can take months or years. So my question is more about the take-home message. Don't you think that it's still useful to do eccentric exercise and strengthening exercise for all the group, even if all the group doesn't need it for now, but he will need it for the future? Or?
Yeah, for sure. And it's like it's like Everett told us. You will probably do the eccentric exercises because you need to do it to get a good performance. So that is, but what my message is, if you think that you will decrease the chances of a guy who has never had hamstring injuries before and who has rather strong hamstring muscles, and you will add Nordics, you will not decrease his chances of for a hamstring injury with that exercise. So it doesn't mean it's not necessary to do, but it's not necessary to do in concern to the prevention of a hamstring injury. I think it's very important to do it concerning his performance. And yes, to keep his muscles as strong as possible, because during maximal sprinting, you will increasingly need these very strong hamstrings if it is in combination with the rest of the trunk muscles or with the posterior chain. Yes, I absolutely agree.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Erik. Maybe in relation to this question as well, if we talk about prevention, we usually talk about one or two things we can do. But if you look at then what we call the prevention paradox, so if we give everybody an exercise, everybody gets a little bit healthier. Or if we give one person an exercise or a program based on their specific risk factors, we will make that one specific person healthier. What if we combine the two? What if we talk about hamstrings? And what should be some exercises or a program that everybody can do, limited, like create a good baseline? And then what are the factors we need to focus on when we want to take the high-risk athletes out?
Well, I think, and that is what you guys are doing with the program, you need to come to an individualized program, to an individualized set of exercises. In my previous life, I have made a program, or we set up a spin-off company, Spartanova, maybe it is known here anyway. It was something like that, but it was not that good because we didn't have the large amount of data you need to do machine learning, so you guys will have it. And based on these machine learning techniques, you will not have one risk factor, but you will have a player with an individual profile. And so if you have weak hamstrings combined with age, combined with this and this and this and this, you will have a high risk for, and he needs to do prevention exercises. Which prevention exercises? Well, it depends on his profile. And that will, to me, that will be the solution how we will manage to decrease our injuries. Because of course, we are not only dealing with hamstring injuries, we're also dealing with, let's say, rectus injuries or ligament injuries. So if one player is at high risk for a hamstring, he should do hamstring exercises. But if one player is not at high risk for a hamstring, but at high risk for an ACL or an ankle sprain, we shouldn't spend too much time on him doing a hamstring prevention program, while it would be more beneficial to give him other exercises to prevent his ankle sprain, ACL sprain, or whatever. So depending on the kind of sport, you need to identify the most important injuries in that sport, and then profile your players and give them an individualized prevention program with a holistic approach, of course. But it's going to be a challenge to have this, because it's so the more we know about it, the more complex it gets.
If we go back to the talk of Evert, we are facing the issue also not only regarding injury prevention, but how we can improve the compliance of the athletes to participate to such a project to be able to better estimate their risk of injury. So regarding more practical aspects, how do you manage with the participants? Maybe with football players it's easier, but I was talking with Kenny and he doesn't agree with that.
No.
So yeah, how do they receive such project and how do you manage to communicate with them? Because it's a big aspect of FULGUR project too. Thank you.
Yes, as you may know, I've been working for Liverpool Football Club for 3 seasons. And I think, and Everett also said it, one of the most important things, I think 2 lessons I learned there. Prevention, they don't give a shit. They don't care about prevention. They are interested in performance. So we stopped calling it a prevention program. We call it a performance program. So we said you should do these and these and these exercises to improve your performance. Now, that simple thing together with immediate feedback of the tests. It was amazing. So before we said it was a prevention program, you had to do your exercises. Nobody did it, or hardly, or yeah, they were doing it a little bit like talking to each other and hey, we have to do it. But then we said it was an increase in performance program, and we gave them immediate feedback. We put it in the cafeteria, where during lunch, they saw these results. They went into this cafeteria, they went to the results. This was the first thing they did. And they were looking and pushing each other. Hey, you see, I'm better than you are. And that created a real atmosphere of competition among these athletes. And immediately they were into this program. And they were all thinking they would improve their performance, which of course it wasn't. But in the long end, it was probably. And I think many of because we are now measuring simple things, but I think we didn't talk about the cognitive aspect, the visual aspects, seeing things beforehand. If you see that a situation, a dangerous situation is occurring, you can prevent running that way. And you can avoid another player, etc., etc. So I think many of the performance parameters are also prevention parameters, and that's why we have to combine this. And I don't see it anymore because we had a medical team and we had a performance team. So which was to me a little bit strange because it's all one team, and we tried to make it one team, and we told the players, there is no medical team and performance team anymore. We are now medical and performance team. And that was a big change in the mentality of the players and the coach also. Because the coach, he doesn't like to spend his time on prevention. But if you say you will improve performance, oh, now the coach is listening. So that was an important lesson to me.
Yeah, there was another question at the back.
Thank you for your presentation. Raphaël, I'm from Stade Français Paris Rugby. I have a question about the muscle typology. Do you have any idea or study about rugby players?
No, we don't.
No.
So that's an easy answer.
Okay.
Sorry. But if you're interested, we can easily measure typology of your rugby players. It's a non-invasive fMRI technique. So they have to go into the fMRI. You need an MRI. I'm saying fMRI, it's MRI. So you need an MRI machine. We can install software. We have to change a little bit. We add a program to the software. And then every player needs to go in the machine, and we can easily find the typology of each individual player.
Thank you for your presentation. If prevention is about performance, that's what we heard this morning, and if it's not possible to prevent injury with healthy people who were not injured, what would be the role of a sports physiotherapist in 2022 for you? So what is the role and what is the place in this structure? Mm-hmm. Because before, the sports physiotherapist was someone who was here to prevent injury in a simple way, not a multifactorial way. So we thought about muscle, about flexibility. So now we are in 2022. What is the role of sports physiotherapy, if there is still one?
Yes, I'm a sports physio, so I will defend them. No. Of course, besides the rehab and the recovery, I think you need to build a team with knowledge in all different aspects. So you need to have knowledge about your nutrition. So you need to have a nutritionist there. You need to have knowledge about the psychological aspect of the players. So you need a psychologist or a physio because if you have a player on your table, he's telling you many different things compared to what he's telling the trainer. So he can give, so the physio, the trainer, the whatever, a performance trainer, they all have experience and specific knowledge, and you need that knowledge to get an holistic approach. As Evert was saying, it's such a complex thing to prevent injuries that you cannot miss one aspect out of that, because then your approach will not be holistic anymore. Do you understand?
It's not so much that we need to stop thinking about what the physical therapist can do. It's about understanding we can't prevent all injuries, but we can mitigate risks. There's clear risk factors shown now by Erik that we can work on. And as a physical therapist, you have a pivotal role in reducing those factors in any player and reduce the risk of injury. So I don't think the role changes that much. I think it's the mindset that changes. You can't make sure the athlete will not get a hamstring injury, but you can certainly reduce the risk of injury.
Thank you very much, Erik. I think it's time to close the session. It was a very nice presentation, and it was very nice also to discuss with you. Thank you very much.